pleasant good morning to Dr. Ken Harvey and fellow friends who are present in this classroom today. My name is Saokit, this is Singwen, and this is Wei Shuo. And today, it's pretty obvious what we're going to present today. We are going to present about newspapers. So firstly, when we think about newspapers, we always think about our parents or our grandparents who are always reading newspapers in the morning with a perfect cup of coffee accompanied beside it. But for us, in our generation, when we think of newspapers, it's not really something that we would take part in our life seriously. So raise your hands if you still read a physical newspaper. Does anyone still read newspaper? All right, good, bless you. Bless you that you're still reading newspapers. All right, so for today, our group members and I, we have gathered every kind of information that we can to show you everything about newspapers. So firstly, let's move on to the agenda of today. Today, we have a lot on our agenda today. Firstly, we will start with the history of newspapers, followed by the impact, newspapers today, Malaysian newspapers, interesting facts, how newspapers are made, the newspaper organization structure, and our conclusion. But the one important thing that I would like to point out today is our questions and answers, because I believe it would be important for all of you to pay attention today, because when we ask our questions, we'll be giving out some prizes for you to, so that you can participate more if you want a little bit of breakfast, snack or something. So, without further ado, let's begin our presentation today. So firstly, let's start off with the history of newspapers. Now firstly, we all know that Chai Lun is the one who invented papers, but he is not the one who created newspapers. All right, so in this era today, let's move back to the 14th century, Johannes Gutenberg. So this is during the time where, in that era, people were already traveling around the countries trying to explore the cultures and do trading. So when Johannes Gutenberg, when he traveled to China, he saw this paper being sold in China. So he was thinking, he was like, this paper, what can I do with this paper? So he took this piece of paper that Chai Lun invented and brought it back to his home back in Europe. So he thought of an idea, because back then, during the time, church priests, when they wrote their manuscripts, they had to do it hand by hand. So it was very difficult to copy and replicate books one at a time, because you have to do it hand by hand. So he was thinking, so what can I do to reproduce several copies at one go? So that's why he created the movable type press, as you can see with that image over there, with the old lady picture, the wooden thing. So he invented the movable type press, and it was a powerful machine that could print over 4,000 pages in one day. So that itself was already made printing much more easier. So when he introduced this to the market, it was immediately mass marketed and sold to the public, because it is very high quality in production and very cheap as well. And that is how newspapers began. So when newspapers were being circulated out in Europe, it meant that people could read and write more. The literacy rate in the country grew. But of course, during that time, the government was still in control of newspapers. They would only said like, okay, you only write what I want you to write to expose to the country, otherwise known as the agenda setting theory. But during that time, because more people, when people read more, they get to learn more. When they learn more, it means that they could think more rationally. When they think more rationally, it means that they began to question the government. So they were wondering, why is it that we are only reading news that only the government wants us to read? Why can't we write what we want to write and read what we want to read? So this was the start of a new era. During the Civil War in England, people wanted coverage of the news because nobody was reporting about the news. Everything that they saw in the newspaper was just all about the government, all of the propaganda. So people started to question. They started to fight for their rights. So in the end, in the end, after the end of all this war, they wanted the freedom of speech. And in the end, the government decided, all right, we will give you the First Amendment of Bill of Rights, which is a law embedded to protect the public. It gives people the right to write however they want, but they need to follow a certain set of rules. So that itself was fair. The society was, kind of happy about it. So let's move on further throughout the years. Throughout the years now, because during that time, newspapers were still more of a luxury thing. During that time, only those who were of prestige level, those who were rich and educated, could read the newspapers. Those who were not rich, who were poor, of middle class or low class, could not have any access to the papers. So that's why this man named Benjamin Day, he created a newspaper company, and he decided, okay, I'm going to sell all of these newspapers for just 1 penny. When he did that, it meant that everyone could buy newspapers. Everyone could have access to newspapers. So because of this important man, Benjamin Day, he was able to industrialize the newspaper today. And not only that, we have James Gordon Bennett. James Gordon Bennett opened a newspaper called the New York Morning Herald. And this newspaper was a bit different. This newspaper was a newspaper that didn't want to really follow what the government wanted them to write. It challenged political news issues. It challenged and questioned the government's doings. So that's what the New York Morning Herald did. And because of all these events happening, it has become to what newspapers are today in the history. So newspapers have created a lot of impacts in the society and the country today, but I will move on to my member Wei Shuo, who will present the impacts of newspapers.
Good morning, everyone. Firstly, let's understand the new types of journalism created thanks to the invention of newspapers. The first is yellow journalism. This is a new journalistic style that relied on an intensified use of sensationalism, which are stories focused on crime, violence, emotion, and sex. This sensationalist style served as the forerunner for tabloid today. Actors relied on shocking headlines to sell their papers, and although investigative journalism was predominant, actors often took liberties with how the story was told. Newspapers often printed an actor's interpretation of the story without maintaining objectivity. They filled their papers with outrageous, sensationalist headlines. At the same time, this style had an impact on the reports of major historical events. As historian Richard Ken Harvey writes, the American press, especially yellow presses such as William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, sensationalized the brutality of the Reconquista and the threat to American business interests. Journalists frequently embellished Spanish atrocities and invented others. The second is objective journalism. At the end of the 19th century, this type of news was still dominated by storytelling. Most newspapers used party writing in instigating public opinion with news. Until 1896, the rise of a new way of writing objectivity or impartiality. This is the embryonic form of objective news. With the spread of objective news style, journalists maintained a neutral attitude to become a common phenomenon. The third is interpretive journalism. With the gradual complication of the world, the reader's psychological and reading needs have undergone great changes. This leads to the gradual elimination of objective news. Readers' demands for explanatory news are increasing, and editors are beginning to think about how to get in touch with readers in the increasingly relevant world. Explanatory news analyze objectively. and are more profound in their explanation of the surrounding confusion. It's for the reader to understand an event more in detail by providing a broader background. The first is literacy journalism. Since the birth of radio in the 60s of the 20th century, literacy news began to appear. It follows objective news coverage, but is more focused through the public opinion. Literacy news certainly influenced the style of the newspaper, but it had a greater impact on the magazine industry. Magazines are more likely to publish this new writing style because of limited time. Literacy news also significantly affected objective news. The objectivity of writing has affected the expression of this person's opinion and became the focus of attention and discussion. Okay, next, I will introduce you to the birth of radio and broadcast news. With the emergence and development of radio news and video brought a series of challenges. In the 1960s, with the popularity of radio technology in most American families, the rise of broadcasting was increasing, and new recording became more and more common. The broadcast revolution brought a new dimension to the news. However, as the radio has further promoted the interpretation of the news style, but also for the printing of news, especially the newspaper, to create a new program. As Robert Maxner observed, many of the factors in the newspaper against the commercial broadcasting were due to concerns about the loss of advertising revenues and the loss of broadcasters. But the birth of radio and broadcast news also caused a series of good effects. For example, in changing the kind of medium to spread the message, people can choose to spread information through various forms of mediums like books and magazines to understand current events, or watch news sites to get information. In addition to reading, people can not only watch TV or radio to obtain information, but also listen to news through the radio. This ways broaden the scope of information and affects the news forms of writing today, like broadcast writing, screenplay writing, script writing. One of the most important writing styles is the inverted pyramid style. This style requires objectivity and involves structuring a story so that the most important details are listed first for ease of readings. First, this style is helpful writers because this style of reporting is somewhat easier to complete in short deadlines imposed on journalists, particularly in today's fast-paced society. Secondly, this style benefits editors who quickly cut the story from the bottom without losing vital information. The editor still has the most important information at the beginning. Thirdly, this style is conducive to traditional reader from the rapid reading to understand most of the content of the news. Next, let's move on to the impact of newspapers in the culture and knowledge exchange segment. Newspaper is a media of communication and information. It promotes people to learn related skills and carries the relevant cultural knowledge and improving people's cultural literacy, expanding people's horizons, while improving people's literacy rate. Newspaper as a universal culture of the media carries the content of a global conducive to the global multicultural collision. The establishment of a mutual contact conducive to the mutual transmission of knowledge. Along with the development of newspapers is the rise and development of the media industry. The media industry's development has undergone major changes. They combine the advertising or other content with news to get more profit, as they identify the control of the content and the circulation of the news, making the rights of media ownership. With the development of the news industry, some of the smaller presses were gradually eliminated. They were acquired by media companies. These high-level enterprises standing on top of the pyramid gradually developed into a monopoly business, monopolized the price of newspapers and the information transmission. But the same also contributed to the rise and development of the advertising industry for the interest of the demand, making the newspaper pay more attention to the link between the public and the journalism. Now let my partner Ximen introduce the next part.
Okay, I will introduce newspaper today. This part, there are two parts in this section: prosperity and decline. And take the U.S. as an example. Let's identify how popular newspaper is at that time. First is the USA Today. Its circulation is 2,281,831. So we can. USA Today focused on the comprehensive news, which is easy to read and understand. And it has visually focused layout with many images. The newspaper is readable, and because the daily newspaper only publishes from Monday to Friday, but this publication also has USA weekend, so it can attract the people who prefer to read continually. And the second is the Wall Street Journal. Its circulation is 2,070,489. It's an international paper focused on economy, business, and financial news. As for its layout, we can see there are more words but few images. And the third is the New York Times. Its circulation is 1,121,623. It balances the images and the words, and besides, this is the most popular online newspaper. There are other major newspapers such as Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune. About this, the number, we can see the newspaper was in a popular trend, but it's a fundamental way for people to get news at that time. But in the recent years, newspaper declined rapidly. So it embodies in following ways. First, the circulation. From 1974 to 2004, during the 20 years, the circulation continued to drop, and especially after 1990s, as until now, it still shows the decreasing trend. And the second is coverage. Coverage of the newspaper can reflect the influence of the newspaper more accurate. But in the 1960s, the coverage of newspaper can reach to more than 32%, but now it can't reach to 19%. And the loss of readership of younger reader is very serious. The third is low growth of advertising market. Because of the universalization of the internet, most of the businessmen prefer to advertise online. And the fourth is layoffs, stock fail, and bankruptcy. According to the date, there are more than 15,000 the newspaper industry in the U.S. lost more than 15,000 jobs in 2009, and in the capital market, many investors lose the confidence to the future of newspaper industry, so they sell the stock. And besides that, there are many newspapers disappeared, even the big publication, such as Rocky Mountain News, although it has published nearly 150 years. So why newspaper decline very rapidly? There is the reasons. First of all, because itself, with the competition heats up, visual competition is inescapable. So, such as the press war. But the main reason is new media. It's immediate. People can know the news when as it take place, and then its convenience whenever and wherever people want to skim news, they can turn to their smartphone, and it's very interactive. People can write down their comments to express their views or opinions, and can share the things happening in their daily life. It's personalized. New media can take care of the people's personal experience. And this is the fact of the decline. First, the GOAs were created. GOA means Joint Operating Agreements. That makes the two newspapers to share the cost to face the challenges of the decline of the readership. But because of the GOA can't stop the decline, it fails and crumbles. The other is ownership. One is the consolidation. Because of the financial troubles, consolidation was in a increasing trend. But because of the high cost, so it still faced the decline, and the reports there. To compete with the television, newspaper editors will put the headline, striking pictures on the page, and they are focused on the in-depth analysis. The last is online newspaper. With the decreasing of readership and the increasing of the internet, many newspapers has embraced culture shift and moved to the online journalism. During the transformation of the newspaper, many professional journalism turned to move to the blogosphere and to become bloggers. The diverse and free content can attract many readers. And this is the summary of the newspaper today. Now we'll watch a video to know about the death of the newspaper.
Okay, so we need to, is the link in here? Where's the link at? Oh, this is the video. Okay, well, we just need to go, we need to tell the,
Okay.
And I'll come back and help you go back again.
It was such a major part of my morning routine. Get up, start the coffee, get the newspaper, read the newspaper, begin the day. Well, newspapers are coming to an end, and no one seems to know how to stop it. Oh, by the way, I'm the reason it's ending. You too. You see, we all get our news this way, or even this way.
Come on, urinate on the street?
But not for long, TV people. This is so quaint now, but it's over, man.
Game over, man. It's game over. What are we gonna do now?
Get your morning star.
In the olden days, a city's daily newspaper or two provided in-depth reporting of local and outside world events.
Paper, mister?
Your daily newspaper.
Why bother now? By the time you get the paper, the news is stale. I must admit, I still like the Sunday paper, but I have time on Sunday. So the newspapers are gone.
Back pages. Where's the news?
Who will provide the local content? Local bloggers? I don't trust them. I blog.
Would you trust me?
It's so sad, but the fact is newspapers brought it on themselves by giving away their content for free. Newspapers also haven't used the web as an opportunity to really take on commercial TV and provide video programming. Why not? Why does their online content have to look like the print edition? It's not the print edition. There are some cockamamie schemes out there like making them non-profit or having the government finance them. Oh, that's a good idea. There's new technologies like wireless readers that might make them more popular. That assumes that people will buy these $200 to $300 devices now, before all the papers go under, and during a recession. Bleak, huh? The physical form of newspapers are dead, but not well-written, solid journalism. Everything changes, and so will the newspapers. I just hope that they can adapt to the new media before it's too late.
We actually have to kind of relaunch this part. Otherwise, they see that exactly what you see. So we'll go back to it and relaunch it. And
All right. So now we have a good concept of what the newspapers are now. So I thought it would be interesting to give some information about Malaysian newspapers. So firstly, for Malaysians here, what are the Malaysian newspapers that you read today? Or you don't read any newspapers? Do you, anyone? Anyone? New Straits Times. All right, wonderful. So I have done a research about the top 3 Malaysian newspapers today. And based on the research, it's quite surprising. The first one is Malaysia Kini, the second one is The Star, and the third one is Sinci Daily. The most surprising fact about this is that Malaysia Kini is not a physical newspaper. It's an online newspaper company. So that is quite surprising because that is the most #1 newspaper being read today. And yes, because we live in a country where many cultures and many diverse cultures live together. So we have Malay, Chinese, Indian, and many other races who live together. So in Malaysia, we have newspapers in several languages. So firstly, Malaysia Kini is an online news website that can be read in many languages. So perhaps that could be one of the most highest benefits. That is why they are the top right now. Now the second one is the Star newspaper. It is also the biggest English newspaper in Malaysia, and it is also owned by a government party known by MCA, Malaysian Chinese Association. And the third one is Sinci Daily, which is the leading Chinese newspaper in Malaysia, but it is also circulated in other countries such as Thailand, Brunei, and Indonesia. So now I have also did one research from the Audit Bureau circulation figures. Don't mind about all these figures, it can be too overwhelming to look at. But when you look here, it has been segregated to Malay newspapers, English newspapers, Chinese newspapers, and Tamil newspapers. And we can see from the figures at the top there, the highest circulation is Malay newspapers, which is quite obvious because in Malaysia we have a higher majority of Malays living in the country. So we have about 1.5 million newspapers being circulated, followed by English newspapers, and then Chinese newspapers, and then Tamil newspapers being the last. So here we can see quite an insight of how Malaysian newspapers are being circulated in the country. The most important being Malay newspapers before being followed by English newspapers. Now, next on, I will move on to my partner who will present the interesting facts of newspapers.
There is some interesting facts of newspaper. I think there are some it's for code facts. First, if everyone recycle the newspaper, we would save 250 million trees each year. It's a huge number, and with the online newspaper, we can reduce the stress of environment. And the fish chips in the UK were originally wrapped in the newspaper before everyone got ink personalizing. Most people only skim through the newspaper. Not many read the entire newspaper. So this is why it's important for us to pay more attention to the headline and lead. And here is how newspapers are made. This is the 4 steps of how to make the newspaper. And first, the reporters collect the news, and then the journalists write down the article with the picture. Then someone will copy everything from the field and transfers to their printing semester. Then it's okay to make a page. Lastly, they will print newspaper out. So let's watch a video to know more about how the newspaper making.
How many times a night would you say generally you have to?
Again, need to go F8 up. And duplicate. And then we get off of that. And you're ready to go.
It's just after 11 p.m. on a Friday night, and in about 8 hours' time, you're going to be opening your weekend paper. But for now, this is what it looks like. We're at Transcontinental Printing in Vaughan, Ontario, to see the Globe and Mail go to press.
I always tell all the folks that work for me, there's only 2 instances of ways to get fired: run out of paper and run out of ink. Plate's aluminum. There's a coating on there so that the image can burn onto the plate. And so what this image is this image allows ink to adhere to where you see an image, and then that image is then offset back onto the paper when the paper runs through the unit. The pumps, which are behind these, pump the ink from here through those pipes out to the presses and down to the presses. Because we run a hybrid product here, which is running both cold set and heat set, we have to have 2 separate sets of ink. The heat set ink is actually a different type of ink that doesn't actually soak into the paper. It sits on top of the paper, and when it runs through the oven on the press, it solidifies the ink, whereas cold set ink actually soaks into the paper. And it's even more complicated because the heat set ink is actually run on a heavier stock. So if you look, the paper's even different.
So it's a complicated process, but worth it, right?
Absolutely.
The first thing you notice when you walk in is the smell. It is overwhelming and powerful, and it's like a mixture of paper and hardware store smell. That's the only way that I can describe it. It's also very loud, which is why I'm wearing these.
So this is we call the quiet room because it's relatively quiet compared to what it's like out there. But this is where the press operators actually run the press. When they're outside, all they're really doing is webbing up the press and hanging plates. Once that's completed, then they come in here and they run the show from inside the quiet room.
How many times a night would you say generally you have to stop at the presses to make a fix or change?
Well, they'll have at least 1 plate change, scheduled plate change every night.
What does that mean they have a scheduled plate change?
They know that we have to get the press started to get the papers put out the door to reach the further distance that the trucks have to go. But by doing that, they'll actually have to start without having some of the latest sports scores and such. So when the sports games are over, whether it's baseball, football, hockey, they'll stop the press, we'll replay those pages, and then we'll get back up and running. Depending on what news is taking place or what sports are going on, there could actually be 2 stops. And it's going to make a lot of difference. Just keep in mind the last file comes at 11 o'clock, but we still have to generate the plate, and then the plate has to come and hang on the press. The press has to start up and get good copy, and the good copy has to go out to post-press, and they have to insert it into the machines out there, create the bundles down the conveyor and into the back of the truck. So there's where your 45-minute window is. The last file is the first paper out.
Well, here we need to turn this off again and find this place. Where is that where we're supposed to be? Anyway, then redo that. It doesn't make that adjustment very well.
Newspaper organization structure divided into 3 levels. We can see the first level is publisher or president. The second level is executive editor, HR, director, ad manager, circulation manager, press manager, IT director. The third level is managing editor, classified ad manager. Now let's go to the question and answer.
Now, as I said earlier, for our question and answer, if you get an answer correct, you will stand to win some prizes. So I hope everyone has been paying attention today. So just raise your hand if you know the answer, and my friends will give out the prizes for you. All right? So let's start with the first question. Who invented the first movable printing type? A. Benjamin Day, B. Chai Lun, or C. Johannes Gutenberg? Anyone? Put your hand out first if you want to try. Okay? C. Okay. All right. Congrats. You win the prize. All right. So the answer is C. Johannes Gutenberg. So let's go on to the second question. Now the second question is, what is the printing press? A. Newspaper sold for just 1 penny. B. A name of a newspaper company. Or C. A name of a revolution where the newspapers were invented. So anyone knows the answer? Okay, wait. Okay, 1, 2, 3. You guys raised at the same time. Okay, you just give whoever you think. Okay, right. So yes, the correct answer is A. Newspapers sold for just 1 penny. So the third question is, which of the following is not true about the events that followed during the history of newspapers? A. The first amendment of Bill of Rights was issued. B. A war broke out because of the need to write freely. Or C. Journalists wanted the freedom of speech to write. So at the count of 1, 2, 3, do raise your hands if you know the answer. 1, 2, 3. No one? Are you sure? Are you sure that you don't want like a prize? You don't want something to eat today? No one? All right. So the correct answer of this is a war broke out because of the need to write freely. Because actually, a war never broke out because of newspapers. It never did. The war broke out because of like political issues, not newspapers really. So now I'll pass on the next question to my friend who will present the next set of answers.
The first question, which of the following types of journalism is false? A. Interpretive journalism. B. Black journalism. C. Objective journalism.
Say count on 1, 2, 3. Count on 1, 2, 3. Say 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Hey, you can't just speak like that. say count. Okay. Within the count of 1, 2, 3, raise your hands up. Then we will choose the one who raised their hands first. Okay. 1, 2, 3. This is too good. Okay. Okay.
Okay. The correct answer is B, black journalism. The fifth question, which of the following is not an impact of newspapers? A, anyone can read the newspaper. B, birds of radio can broadcast the news. C, increase the literacy rates. 1, 2, 3. Okay, the correct answer is A, anyone can read the newspapers. The sixth question, why did media ownership happen? A, the need of money. B, to protect the citizens. C, they wanted to control the circulation and the content of news. 1, 2, 3.
I saw him raise his hand.
Okay.
Yeah?
The answer is
Yeah, the answer is C.
the correct answer is C. They wanted to control the circulation and content of news.
So this is a question about newspaper today. Why is the newspaper industry dying? 1, 2, 3.
No?
A, 他说 A.
A. All right.
Yeah.
Then which of the following are not factors of newspaper extinction? 1, 2, 3.
No, say the answer. No, explain the question, like A, B, and C.
So which one? Oh,
A.
no. It's B, increasing interest of using social media because of the interest, not just the using. And the last, what is being done to save the dying newspaper industry? 1, 2, 3. Which one?
C.
Yes, C. So it's time to our conclusion.
All right. So throughout this whole presentation, we have seen the birth of newspapers, the rise of newspapers, and including the decline of newspapers. So basically, we have presented about the life of newspapers, how it has impacted the society and the world today, as well as the decline and the challenges that the newspaper industry now struggles. So as you can see, these three pictures kind of represent how newspapers are right now. It started off as something brand new to the society and soon changed into something revolutionary, and it's now being conquered by technology now. So now we can begin to question, where is newspapers going to head now? Are they really going to die, or are they going to continue to live on in the technology world? So these are our references for today, and thank you.
Okay, so we saved data we really needed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, good job by Team 7. Anybody that hands out treats has to get a good grade, obviously. There a number of things, brought up a number of issues that can be expanded on. I don't think, this is where I was going to give you the virtual tour, but their video did a pretty good job. Maybe just explain a couple of aspects that maybe weren't real clear. When they were showing you the plates, those were, I mentioned the other day, aluminum plates that they can bend around the cylinders. So that's why they're made out of aluminum, is that they need to bend and bend around a round cylinder that goes around real fast. So, and then they showed that the image was made, that's made by basically a laser effect on the coating on the aluminum plate, creates the image of the newspaper on that aluminum plate, but is not raised type. It's not, it used to be raised. In fact, even when I first started in the daily newspaper, they still used a raised, almost like a rubber stamp sort of plate. It was made out of plastic instead of aluminum. But in order to use raised print, they didn't, well, they had to, like I said, it's kind of a rubber stamp effect, but like for a photograph, one thing you may not have heard this term before, halftone. Anybody know what a halftone is by chance? A halftone is a photo that you see printed, because a halftone is not really a picture. It's a optical illusion. If it's black and white, it is totally made up of black dots. There's no gray ink in a black and white photo in a newspaper, for example. It's made out of black dots, but where you think you see gray, the dots are smaller, so you see white around it. And so it makes it so by the size of the dots, bigger or smaller, and the amount of white that you can see in the background, you think you see gray, but you don't see gray. It's all an optical illusion that fools our eyes. There's no gray ink used in a black and white photo. Those dots that's what makes it a halftone. And in color, it's essentially the same thing, except you have at least, well, you have 4 colors. In printing, you have the black, you have cyan. Cyan is a kind of a light blue. Magenta is your red, and then they have yellow. And they combine those 4 colors, black, magenta, cyan, and yellow, to create all the colors for color photos. But anyway, so a halftone is just basically the optical illusion of a photograph, in essence. You saw how rapidly that press ran. So I don't, the video's better than my PowerPoint. It was mentioned that when Gutenberg created his press, he could get up to 4,000 a day, 4,000 copies a day. But that was probably of just one sheet. These presses are called web presses, the way they run through. So you have multiple presses, and so your paper is running in and out, and all these pages, all these sheets coming from these big rolls of paper, half-ton rolls of paper, are coming together, webbing together. That's why they call it a web press. They then go through a cutter and folder. So they're printing all the pages of the newspaper simultaneously, and even this relatively small press that my newspaper had runs at a top speed, a rate of 80,000 newspapers an hour. So Gutenberg to do one page and get his 4,000 a day, we can put out 80,000 an hour of all the pages of the newspaper in today's journalism. So it's a very different world, which is why I mentioned the other day that it's difficult. One of the difficulties in the Poe book is his looking at the media, and he focuses on different parts of that maturation process. And so printing is one thing when you're at Gutenberg's stage, at the very beginning of the print age, and it's a totally different thing when you get to the end, where we're kicking out 100,000 an hour of all pages of a newspaper. A very different process. and effect from it. And we've, as I mentioned, with the newspaper they're talking about, I think they said their last deadline was at 11 o'clock because of the number of papers they're putting out and so forth. The newspaper I was at, our deadline was 12 o'clock. They plan on stopping the press every so often to change plates because they're changing the news. They're gonna print the newspapers for the farthest distances first, and so they can get them on the truck or whatever and get them shipped out as quickly as they to those distant locations, and then they'll print the ones that are closest to the press later in the process, and they will change those plates and update the content. We didn't chase a lot in our newspaper. We're a smaller newspaper. About at the time I was there, about 45 to 50,000 copies a day. But just occasionally, I was in one instance, for example, there was it was after midnight, so we were already past deadline. We had sent the last pages. We'd put them out in desktop publishing, which again is what I teach in my editing class. So we sent the electronic version of the pages to the plate making process, and suddenly we heard over a police scanner that a car had run run into the big river that's close to where I live, the Columbia River. They thought there were 4 or 5 people in the car. They were calling out search and rescue to bring out scuba divers to go down and try to save them. And because all of our reporters had left by then, the editors are the last one out the door. When I was the very last one out the door, I was the late editor, so I was the one checking the paper when it came off the first copies when they came off the press to make sure it was done properly. There weren't any glaring errors in headlines and stuff like that. But anyway, so here we get this car running off into the river. And so since there were no reporters, I ran out myself to cover that incident. It ended up taking a lot longer than I thought it would. So like I say, we heard it right just a few minutes after 12 midnight. I didn't get back in until 1 o'clock because it took so long for the search and rescue scuba divers to show up. It was still unclear whether anybody would survive. They were underwater. The car was underwater for almost a whole hour, but they wouldn't let anybody dive in who wasn't a scuba diver, which I still have regrets because they did all die. I still thought, they said, well, you go down there and you open a door, then the water all goes in and they're going to die for sure, or you break a window, you can't dive in. I don't know how deep the water was right there, whether I could have even reached them. I would think that it wouldn't have been that deep because it was close to the shore, but the river drops off pretty fast right there. Anyway, so all this stuff is going on. I get get back to the office at just about 1 o'clock, maybe 5 minutes after 1. Because of this was going on, anyway, there was other people kind of waiting for me to get back, and they gave me 10 minutes to write a page 1 story. That's the challenge of being a newspaper writer. And so you better know your craft pretty well, because I had to put out about, I'm not sure how many words it would be, probably about almost, like 400 words in 10 minutes. And meanwhile, people were calling the hospital to find out to try to get updated information, whether people were dead or they were basically still working on them. So we at that point, didn't know if they had died, but we kind of suspected they probably would at that point. Anyway, so then after 10 minutes, they run it down. We replaced a front page story that was already there, put in the local story. It was an Associated Press story in the bottom of the front page. Throw that out, put in the local story, stop the presses, change that plate, and start it up again so that as many of our newspapers as possible could get that last minute story. That's what they sometimes call, chasing a story. So when you hear these sometimes in a movie or whatever, stop the presses, with the idea that they need to chase a story and replace a story. So in the case of that video, they were doing that routinely because they had such a high circulation that they wanted to update their news at certain times, at least once during the evening, and sometimes perhaps twice to get the very updated. One of the last things that they just mentioned, by the way, it may be for some people a little, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but the fact that one of the main things they wanted to stop the presses for was to get the last sports scores. Yeah, get the last sports scores. Sports is very, very important in the daily newspaper particularly. They shared an organizational chart, and I wanted also just to go back to that. This is really a rather, well, I mean, it doesn't cover everything, obviously. It doesn't have any reporters on there, for example. But the idea is to show you, make you think about how complex a newspaper is. And this is really made up of, this is the medium-sized newspaper that I worked at. So it has, under 50,000 circulation. When you start getting to a newspaper like the New York Times or USA Today or whatever, it gets much more complex. Because once you get up to to 1 million or something, yeah, you're going to have lots of people running around. It also becomes more complex in the sense, for example, at our newspaper with 50,000 circulation, we had about 50 people in the newsroom to put out a 50,000 circulation newspaper. I don't know what the New York Times has, but I know I watched a video presentation by the former executive editor of the Washington Post, and at their peak they had 900 people in their newsroom. So imagine the difference between having 50 people in your newsroom and 900 people in your newsroom. It gets much more complicated. So they have a lot of editors below the editors. So you take a look just at, forgetting all these other parts, you have your press manager, you still have a press manager, all these other things, you're going to have these managers. Classified ads are the little reader ads that individuals might put in to sell their car or something like that. That was extremely lucrative for newspapers in America, the classified ads. And it's one of the biggest hits they've had is that they've lost most of their classified advertising to online services. In fact, they have, by name, there's a service called Craigslist. I don't know if it's available here. I think I have seen it here. Anyway, Craigslist is free advertising for what we call classified advertising. So help wanted, sell your car, all this sort of stuff, you get to put it up there free. And so that just totally killed the classified section of the newspapers in America. When I was your age, one of the things they taught us was you could tell how successful a newspaper was by how big their classified section was. And a real successful newspaper would have a classified section, basically, with the big newspapers, they might have had a classified section of, 50 pages or so. Ours was probably average maybe 12 pages of small classified ads that people would put in our paper. And in the case of the newspaper, they had to pay for it. Along comes Craigslist, they no longer have to pay for it. Craigslist is making their money from other, like, paid advertising on the same page with the free advertising, stuff like that. So most of the stuff in certainly the upper part, this is pretty accurate in all newspapers. But then when you get below this, when you get below the managing editor, for example, we would have our Metro editor we'd have a Metro editor. Metro editor was in charge of, he oversaw all of our reporters who were working locally. And then we had a sports editor who'd oversee all the reporters working just on sports. We had a features editor that worked just, we had one section out of 4 sections every day. That is sections that you could pull them apart and they would they existed separately, so to speak. She was in charge of the feature section, and one day it might be, in fact, it was, every day was a little different. Like Wednesdays was a food section, so there might be recipes, might be ideas for, nutritious food, things like that, because that was the day that grocery stores put in their big ads. And so our feature section, which would include the grocery store ads, was all about food. The next day on Thursday, I'm starting the middle of the week because of the food, but next day or Thursday we had it be a business section. Friday was entertainment section. I'm not sure what Saturday was. Sunday was kind of a general section, just general features, really good feature stories. I don't remember what Monday was or Tuesday was. But anyway, every day that feature section changed, and so the feature editor was in charge of that. Might only really have one big local story, and then mostly feature stories off the Associated Press wire for the rest of that section. But anyway, so those are some of the people underneath the managing editor. You get to a larger newspaper, then you might have an education editor. You might have a political editor. You might have, a business editor separate. You start breaking off to these smaller editor positions because you have 900. If you're at the Washington Post, you have 900 reporters. You can't make them all report to the Metro editor. That's impossible. So they start having a lot of editors underneath that editor, and dividing the responsibility. One of the discussions in all of that organization is, where do you put copy editors? Copy editors are, that was my main title at that newspaper, was to produce the pages themselves electronically, write the headlines, or design the pages, and again, produce it electronically before you send it to the plate room to be made into a plate. Where do you put those copy editors, and who do they report to? The general organization has been that you have a news editor who oversees the copy editors, and he kind of directs what news will go on each page. And so he might give a copy editor a page and say, okay, I put into the queue one local story and 3 wire stories to go on this page. There's you. Take off. Do it. And so he's a news editor. The reason that title is that he's the one that's kind of directing where to put the different news. I served also as a wire editor, which I was just watching the wire all day. We had wire coming in from the Associated Press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and I had to watch all those stories coming in and decide what should I recommend for the front page. What should I put on other pages that were basically given to me by the news editor? He might give a page to me and say, okay, Ken, fill this with national news, fill this with local or regional news, whatever, and I would then assign the stories myself. But I might have to skim through 1,000 stories as the wire editor, because that's how many stories we had coming in. Some of them I would skim very quickly. They would typically have kind of a summary of the story, so I might not even have to open it to know, nah, it's probably, we don't have room for that one, I won't worry about that one, or whatever. So it gets much more complex than this once you get below this level. And it will depend on how many people you have in your staff as to how many other editor positions you must have. One of the things, because of the decline of advertising, in fact, let me go back. We were talking about Benjamin Day. They were talking about him creating the penny press. So how much money do you make on a penny newspaper? Basically nothing, right? You're going to have to give some to those newsboys running out and saying, get the newspaper, and whatever. They've got to make some money off this, or they're not going to go. And so basically they were giving that newspaper away free. So how were they making their money then? How did they survive? Well, that transition to a penny press also was a transition to total advertising dependence. Your main revenue then had to be advertising. And that is now the downfall of the newspapers, is that they sell cheap. They make no money off of their distribution. They're lucky to break even on distribution, and they depend on advertising to pay their bills. but the advertising is going online to Google and Facebook and whoever else. So their revenues are declining very rapidly, which is killing the newspapers because advertising follows the audience. I probably mentioned that before, but that always keep that in mind. In this business, the advertising follows the audience. I was probably 7 years ago, I predicted that there was going to be a huge increase in mobile advertising. How did I predict that? Was I a genius? Not really, but somebody already, this was before, this is right at the start of smartphones when I made that prediction. But there was a organization that had done an analysis of how much time people spend in each of the different media. And they spent, I don't have the chart here right in front of me, but let's say they spent 40, I think it's probably more than that, but anyway, 40% of their media time on TV. And they spent, at that point, 5% of their media time with newspapers, but they spent actually more time with their mobile phones than with newspapers. But the newspapers were getting more advertising than just about anything except TV. So the newspapers were getting like 30% of all the advertising, and yet the people were only spending 5% of their media time reading the newspaper. Meanwhile, the mobile phone was getting almost no advertising at that point, but people were spending more time with their mobile phone than they were the newspaper. And so it was real easy in a free market to say, wow, there's going to be a big change there, because the free market is like a vacuum cleaner. You know, it just sucks in investment and sucks in attention and sucks in innovation. And so once you saw that people were spending more time on the mobile phone than they were the newspaper, it was very easy to say, watch out for this area over the next few years. There's going to be it's going to blow up. It's just going to explode, the amount of advertising. They're going to figure out that at that time it was just SMS advertising on mobile phones. That's all there was. Boring, ineffective advertising. And so I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew somebody was going to figure out how to use mobile phones to produce better, more effective advertising, because there was that vacuum. There was all that time people were spending on their mobile phone and no advertising. And so it was inevitable that the free market was going to drag in huge amounts of advertising over the next few years, which of course it has. Anyway, this one is a little bit more detailed. Again, this was the way it looked at our 50-person newsroom. So most of the local reporters were answering to the Metro and City editor. We had a state reporter and some other people, but ours was a largely local newspaper, so we didn't have a national editor. We didn't have economics editor, a business editor. Those all came through the Metro editor. We did have our feature editor, our sports editor. News editor, again, was over the copy desk, and the wire editor, so I worked under the news editor. A photo editor, and a graphics editor to do charts and maps and stuff like that. So this was a Sunday editor too. The Sunday paper is so big, or it was then anyway, that we named an editor to just be in charge of the Sunday paper. He did other stuff too. He did work on other pages during the week, but all week long he had to be thinking in advance of what to do with the Sunday paper, accumulating feature stories throughout the week to use, and because we knew we didn't have enough staff to totally fill the Sunday paper with local news because it was just too big of a newspaper. So the Sunday editor had to start planning in advance, and that was the one edition where we printed one section in advance on Saturday. We printed earlier on Saturday one section of the Sunday newspaper, and then we printed the rest later that night and inserted the first section that was pre-printed because it was just too big for our press to handle. The one thing they didn't ask him about in stopping the press was stopping it to add the rolls of paper. Maybe going down to where I can show you our press. That's just a mock-up of the press, 3 stories high. So it takes up you know, a lot of space. This, like I say, this is 3 stories, literally 3 stories of a building like this high. So the bottom story was the paper floor. The second one was where the presses were actually working, and then the top was part of the webbing all the pages together. These rolls of paper weigh half a ton down here, and they don't come anywhere close to printing, to being able to last the entire night. I think when I interviewed our press crew for my PowerPoint, they said they averaged 24 rolls of paper a day, which means 12 tons of paper a day were going into our small newspaper, relatively small newspaper, compared to the New York Times. So if we were going through 24 rolls, 12 tons of newspaper a day, the New York Times with about 20 times as many, much circulation, and probably more pages as well, you can multiply that real fast, and well, maybe not fast, but 20 times 24, if it's 20 times bigger, 24 times 24 rolls, that's 480 rolls of paper they're going to go through, and that's not counting the fact that they would be a bigger newspaper, not just more circulation, but more pages as well. So they might be going through nearly 1,000 rolls of paper a night. Just think of the storage problem with that, 1,000 rolls, half-ton rolls of newspaper. My pictures just show that the storage room in our little newspaper, those are all rows of newspaper stacked up on top of each other, because they had to make sure they had plenty in case the next shipment didn't come in or whatever, in case there was a strike, in case there were a strike by the truck drivers or a strike by the paper company or whatever. They had to make sure they had lots of paper, and so they had a huge warehouse just for our small newspaper. The New York Times would have to have one 20 times that big, and this isn't showing up all of our storage area. So multiply that by 20 times for the New York Times, and you get some concept of just what they need to store their paper with. A huge operation, and very, very complicated. Okay. Other than that, this is a small press, a small web press, so this is less than 1 story high, but I took a picture of it just to kind of give a better idea of how these run. So you're running a roll of paper up through here, and then up through here, and up through there, and up there, and they all coming together to create this web of pages that all get printed simultaneously. You have to make sure they adjust perfectly so all the pages get cut, and you're not cutting off pieces of a page or whatever, and getting folded properly and so forth. I guess I had that there. Forgot. Let me address a few things from the first presentation before I go to some additional statistics and information that I can add to it. They talked about different type of journalism. The yellow journalism is kind of sensationalism, exaggerated a lot in order to get attention. There is still yellow journalism practiced in America. I don't know if it is here, but sometimes there are, the National Enquirer is an example that it's sold at grocery stores. Its exclusive distribution is at grocery stores. So it sells for like $1. It's in tabloid size, so it's smaller size than the big broadsheet. In inches, a tabloid is about 11 inches, like that, I guess, by 17 inches, something like that. So it's half the size of what we call a broadsheet newspaper. And so it's made more convenient. A lot of good newspapers are going to tabloid because it's more convenient for people to take with them on the subway or whatever. But anyway, so tabloids, because the first newspapers that really pushed the tabloid format, the smaller format, were these sensationalized grocery store newspapers. In America, tabloid has a negative connotation. Even though all it means is the size of the newspaper, it shouldn't have a negative connotation. Some very good newspapers are tabloid in size, but because the first ones were sensationalized, like the National Enquirer, try with crazy headlines that get your attention, and then you read the story and it's they've really exaggerated basically to create their headline. So it has a negative connotation as being not very credible. Interesting, but not credible. And so those newspapers still exist. They're very much yellow journalism, sensationalized newspapers. We definitely went through the objective era. I would say right now we are not in the objective era anymore. It may be the what you might call the interpretive era, I guess, still, which, as they mentioned, was interpretive / investigative. So especially beginning with Watergate, when our President Richard Nixon was kind of chased out of office for a scandal he was involved with, the reporters have become more interpretive at that point. They've started, I've interviewed a lot of the top award-winning reporters, and they feel like it's their duty to come to a conclusion. And if you come to a conclusion of who's guilty, who's not guilty, that's not objective, right? You're not letting, which if you're right, if you find the scoundrel and you can prove and send him to prison, then that's a good thing. But if you are biased in your approach, if you already believe somebody's guilty before you start doing your research, that's not a good thing. And I think right now in America we have a lot of reporters who are very biased in their approach, and they're biasing the news with their agenda setting. They're choosing which stories to chase and which stories to ignore. They're biasing it with their selection of sources, those that agree with them, and rather than the ones that disagree with them. And they're biasing it by their writing, the words they choose, the organization of their stories, emphasizing what they want to emphasize. That is not necessarily true. But at the same time, one of the questions that was raised by Team 7, maybe not emphasized, but raised, was what will happen now that these big newspapers are losing their advertising. On average, 2/3 of their advertising from 2005 to now, lost 2/3 of their advertising. Who's going to do the investigative reporting? Who will have the budget to assign reporters to investigate a scandal? I mean, there still are, but how about 10 years from now? Who will be investigating the scandals? It is a major question. They mentioned on one of the videos that there have been some people suggest that the government should be giving grants to newspapers. But that's a very basically, especially conservatives do not trust the government to do anything. I mean, in America, the government just paid a bunch of money because under the Obama administration, the Internal Revenue Service, the taxing agency, had become politicized, and they were penalizing conservative groups with the use of their taxing policies. And so they just had to pay a bunch of money to those groups that they were acting in a prejudicial way against. So that's a lot of the government itself is becoming polarized and politicized right now. If you give them the authority to who will they give money to, well, they're going to give it to the newspapers they like, basically. So especially conservatives would not trust the government to get involved in anything relating to the free press, because by its very nature, government is biased and will skew it. So that's not a good solution, but I don't know what the solution is. One of the Pulitzer Prize winners from the Watergate scandal, the Richard Nixon scandal, just said basically, when there will always be people who will be investigators, who will be driven to find out the truth. In the 1980s, or excuse me, in the 1800s, most of those investigators were book authors. They weren't newspaper journalists. The big scandals were uncovered by book authors. So who knows what and right now, I'd say the organization that, and this again, it goes against the grain of a lot of people who don't like what they're doing, but right now the best investigative reporter in the world is a felon. You know, that's WikiLeaks. They released more information that showed crimes were being committed by people in the government and so forth than all the newspapers put together. Thousands of documents to show inappropriate behavior by the U.S. government and other governments, as well as individuals in political parties and stuff. Thousands and thousands of documents. So the best investigator right now is a felon because he's hacking websites, hacking emails, and getting these documents illegally. And so the United States would like to put him in prison. But he's the best reporter we have out there. So I have very mixed feelings. He may have disclosed things he shouldn't have, but he certainly has disclosed a lot of stuff I'm glad he did. So it's a whole new world that we're dealing with. They mentioned the broadcasting, and they didn't, to me, give a real clear connection between newspapers and broadcasting. But certainly in the early days, basically people, the TV stations and radio stations were just basically reading the newspapers online on the air. Even now, most TV stations don't have very big news staffs, and so even though they get a lot of audience on the TV news, they don't do near as much. They don't have near as big a staff. They don't do near as much or as good reporting as newspapers do, at least in America. And it's also harder to put together a TV story. It takes longer to put together a good news story for TV and to do the investigations with what one of the Pulitzer Prize winners called the 2,000-pound pencil. It's not quite 2,000 pounds anymore. They can use smaller cameras and take fewer people and their crew to go do a good story. But nonetheless, it's much more cumbersome than with a newspaper. So the newspapers have carried, I mentioned, the investigative reporting role in America primarily. Some TV stations have done a pretty good job, but one of the people that I interviewed won his Pulitzer as a newspaper reporter, and then was recruited by, I think it's NBC, to become their investigative reporter. So he was kind of a one-man investigative reporting organization. He had to travel all over the country to do his interviews and stuff. So, and if he got one story every couple of weeks, they'd be very happy because he was on his own trying to dig up good stories. He later on went to CNN. They talked about the joint operating agreements. That was where, see, in America they don't want to. They have laws against monopolies, and they have laws against two organizations conspiring together. And so before the Congress passed the joint operating agreement law, they did not allow newspapers to cooperate with each other. They said that's conspiratorial. You guys are conspiring to control the market together. But then, as they were going broke, the Congress realized, well, to save two newspapers in a city, we need them to maybe use the same advertising salespeople, some of the other same management people to save money, and have totally separate reporting staffs, but do some things together to save money. In Seattle, that was the case, close to where I live, but still one of the first newspapers to go broke was one of the Seattle newspapers, the Seattle PI, they called it, the Post-Intelligencer. It went broke. They have an online presence. Some of the former reporters decided to create a website, and so they Some of them are still working on the website, but they no longer have a printed edition. And it's actually, ironically, which it points out one of the the problems in analyzing this, the economics, is that it was the bigger newspaper that went broke. It wasn't the smaller. There were two newspapers, it and the Times, Seattle Times. Seattle Times was apparently in a better economic position for some reason, perhaps owned by a stronger chain, but it survived, and the PI with like 400,000 circulation went broke. You would think if you have 400,000 circulation, you should be able to survive. But it gets much more complicated because you have unions involved. And the unions would say, no, you can't lay anybody off. The unions have dictated a lot of things that have been self-destructive. And so in the case, probably it was a management union problem that they could not cut back enough in order to save the newspaper. And so they finally had to kill the newspaper, which killed all the jobs. If unions want to help save newspapers, if they want to save their jobs, they need to start cooperating with management, because the management is in a terrible position right now to save the newspaper without the cooperation of unions. If they could lay off enough people, if they could make the right decisions, there's no reason that the PI should have gone out of business, but they did. The other thing that could happen, there's a few newspapers who have pursued this, but in the typical newspaper in America, they only make money 3 days a week. They go out 7 days and they make money 3 days. I kind of mentioned those already. Wednesday is when they have all the grocery store ads, typically. Friday is when they have all their entertainment ads. And Sunday is just a day that lots of people advertise because they know people have more time. They're sitting around during the day, not doing anything else, so they have a lot of attention on the newspaper. So lots of ads. The biggest advertising day is Sunday. So if the typical newspaper wanted to save itself, it should become tri-weekly. It should kill all the other pages. All the other days lose money for the typical newspaper. So they ought to go tri-weekly in print and daily online. Maintain a daily news presence and only 3 times a week. If they don't do that, if they don't make that sort of decision, they will die, because they're losing money, so much money during those other 4 days that they, again, and they're, what we're seeing on this, let me get to this before we run out of time. When you start, a lot of other things I was going to share, but just look at some of these charts here. This is actually a positive thing. With the big newspapers, some of them are getting quite a few readers online. But like the New York Times, while it's getting readers online, they will charge you a subscription fee to get access to all of their news. But one reason why they have a lot of news readers is that they're giving a lot of it away free. And so I get emails from the New York Times all the time offering, letting me read their best stories. I'm not going to subscribe to the New York Times when I have access to news every place else in the world. So they're not going to get me to subscribe, but they're trying still to get people to subscribe. So they give away their best stories, and they want people to pay them to get their worst stories, which that's not a good strategy, I don't think. Most of the newspapers cannot get people to pay for their news. And at the same time, they can't get the advertisers to pay as much money to follow the audience online. And the audience itself is not going to just to their websites very much either. So it's become a terrible combination. So in here, again, we're seeing here, this is unique visitors in 1 month, January 2015, in thousands. So during that month, the USA Today, okay, the black is desktop, the orange is mobile. So you see the USA Today gets more mobile visitors than desktop. That's an important change in how people are getting their news. And altogether they had, about 60, well, this is 60,000, but it's in thousands, so it's 60 million unique visitors to the usatoday.com site. That's a good number. But they're not spending much time there, and they're not getting much advertising in exchange for those 60 million visitors. New York Times, like I said, is close to the same. I'm not sure if USA Today even tries to sell subscriptions. New York Times does, but many of these people are just going to their best stories that they give away free. Anyway, you see how it goes. So these numbers are pretty respectable for the large newspapers, but this is just 10 newspapers in the world. And in America, as I mentioned the other day, there were at its peak more than 12,000 newspapers. And here you see some of them are doing pretty well, getting people to go online, but they're still losing money off of that. That's still, they haven't get the advertising to go. The New York Times, for the median age, the average age of the New York Times reader is 60 years old. That also tells you something. You know, the average age overall in America is 37. So young people are not reading the New York Times. So it is truly a dying breed. They're falling fast, and they're going to, you know, over the next 10 years, a lot of these people that are reading the New York Times are going to die, literally die. Their readers are dead. So that will have a huge impact. We see this was done a few years ago, and I think it's much more stark than this now. But the baby boomers, my generation, about 53% of us still like to get our news from the printed newspaper, but only 22% of the millennials, so less than half. TV, 92% of the boomers like TV news, or they did a few years ago. I think it's dropping dramatically, even among the boomers. Among millennials, it's 75% and falling, I'd say, rapidly. Radio, you know, people are still commuting, so they listen to news on their radios. They're commuting to work and stuff. But millennials are probably plugging in their mobile phone and listening to their music or whatever during that time, rather than listening to the news like the boomers are. Magazines are, again, less attention by the millennials. And again, these percentages are at least 5 years old. I've been using these statistics quite a while. So I'm positive it has changed dramatically, but it still gives you an idea. Smartphone down here, millennials at 40%, boomers at 12%. So, you know, obviously, in the tablets, more millennials, obviously, computer, more millennials, and all of those. So they're accessing, by and large, by mobile or internet. The ad sales have declined. This is a couple of years old, probably now the 13th straight year. And they've lost 2/3 of their print advertising during that time. I'm not going to. This will be uploaded to, or it has already been uploaded to, the Moodle site. This is what one professor says. It basically says, just kill it. Not kill the newspaper. One professor says they should have killed their print newspaper like 10 years ago and gone totally online, forced the readers online then by killing their newspaper. This one says, kill the online. You're doing such a bad job of your online version. You're making no money from it. You're wasting lots of resources. You might as well accept your fate, put your efforts into your printed version until you're dead, because you're not doing anything with the online version. This is a graphic representation of the advertising revenues. The orange is their online advertising. So this is very disturbing. You see, in 2005, they were all the newspapers in America together, or at least the newspapers in the Newspaper Association of America anyway. They were already selling $2 billion, this is in billions, $2 billion worth of advertising in 2005. It went up to 2.7 billion in 2006, 3.2 in 2007. Look down here at 2014. Online advertising only 3.5 billion. So between 2007 and 2014, they've increased in a very small way their advertising online. This is why they're dying. And see what in the black is their print advertising. What's happened to that in the meanwhile? Their online advertising has come nowhere close to replacing their lost print advertising. The numbers will look similar, maybe not in actual total numbers, but the proportions would be very same for TV stations. TV stations have also not done much in selling advertising online on their websites. And that's why both local TV stations and local newspapers are going to die. They just can't, and part of the problem is that you can't, at a certain point you lose your benefits of scale. When you're putting out big newspapers, you have big circulation, you have lots of advertising, you have, the cost per copy is much less. When you reduce your circulation, you still have to pay the people to distribute it the same amount. Whether it's a big newspaper or a small newspaper, to put it on the doorstep costs the same. And so your economy of scale doesn't work anymore. So at some point, a newspaper has to give up. They get so little advertising, they cannot maintain their operation in a way that will lead to success. And many of them are going into debt trying. So they go into debt. So even the New York Times, back in 2009, I think, or 2010, borrowed $300 million from a Mexican billionaire. So that's the New York Times, with all their massive circulation, had to borrow $300 million to keep their operation going. So it's not a pretty picture. And the other disturbing picture, I'll come back to that. This is Google versus the newspapers. Green is the print ads, black are the newspaper digital ads, and the silver is Google advertising. So see what has happened. You know, in 2003, Google was just barely getting started, almost no advertising. The newspapers built up. 2005 was their best year ever in history. You know, just 12 years ago, their best year ever in selling advertising. In 2005 or 2006, I'm not sure, but that executive editor, former executive editor of the Washington Post, said that in one of those years they were doing so well, making so much money, they thought that the impact of the internet would be maybe years away. And so they added people to their staff. And so they had 900 people, they added more people. And the very next year they realized, oops, in 1 year things changed dramatically. And they realized they were fools, they were idiots. That's where this tipping point idea comes in. This is the tipping point idea, is that you'll have a small impact, a small impact, a small impact, but just the same as if I were standing this on its end here and tipping it, at a certain point it collapses, right? Glass of water, same thing, you can tip it, bam, it's going to fall real fast. That's the idea of a tipping point, is that you have what seems to be really small changes in society. And people think, oh, well, just look at how slow it's changing. It's going to take a long time for it to happen. Everybody knew the internet was going to have a giant impact. But because it was gaining its impact so slowly, we got fooled by it. And that's the very nature of a tipping point, is you get fooled by how slow something starts. Just a little at a time, we're fine, we'll add more people, bam. And that's what happened. And that's what's happening right now in broadcast, in the TV stations in America. My prediction was actually 2 years ago when I wrote this chapter for this book, that they had just hit their tipping point. They didn't know it yet. They just hit their tipping point. 2 years before that, they were doing the best ever in history. Well, that's what happened in the newspapers too. They got to their best place in history, and then it is now collapsing because that audience is running away to the internet. It is a dramatic change. As I mentioned before, a lot of the textbooks are still really out of date, in the sense that they're still yelling, conglomerates, conglomerates, boo, boo, boo. They're killing us. They're dangerous. They're scary. Conglomerates. Well, that green line is the conglomerates. They're dying. The scary now is really Facebook and Google. They're the ones with the monopoly, but they're different. There is some suggestion that they are. There has been some research that suggests they are manipulating things for political purposes a little bit. There are some people who have done Google searches and found that they are some maybe stacking the deck in favor of liberal causes a little more than conservatives. And same with Facebook, because both the owners of Google and the owners of Facebook are liberal politically. But it's still very hard. If Facebook becomes too overtly anti-conservative, what's going to happen? They're suddenly going to have a competitor, because the conservatives are going to jump to somebody else, and suddenly Yahoo or somebody, or MySpace or somebody like that, or probably a brand new entity is going to come up and compete with Facebook. So Facebook itself, it actually, I think I mentioned the other day, Facebook was controlled by conservative users in this last presidential election in America. So even though the owners are liberal, and they may have tried to manipulate it a little bit, they were overwhelmed by conservatives wanting to push the Trump or the Republicans or whatever. They wanted to get rid of Clinton and Obama and the people they didn't like. And so the main medium that won the election for Trump was a liberal medium, but that did not control its own content because it's a social medium. And so the conservatives overwhelmed Facebook and won the election for Trump. This is a brand new dynamics, and it's still evolving, because right now, like I say, even the owners of Facebook and of Google are still kind of wondering, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? We don't like this guy. How do we keep this from happening again without killing our own business? So they're in a trap. If they get too overtly anti-conservative, they will lose their business. So it's kind of so economically they should not be doing anything. They should let it play out. But politically, they may be tempted to do something stupid. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. Will they go for their politics or will they go for their economics? We'll see. So those are I will show some other statistics when we get to broadcasting, but as I said, there's I'm the only one saying it perhaps, but my prediction 2 years ago was that local TV stations had just reached their tipping point. They didn't even know it yet. And I'll go through that when we get to broadcasting. But I think they're there already, and they've got about 10 years before their chart is looking like this. Well, I guess a couple of things I need to talk about. Is there anything in here that really jumps out? Lots of things I'd like to talk about, but I had a question. You had 1, 2, and 3 news sources, but they didn't seem to jive with that bigger table that you had. So on what basis are they 1, 2, and 3, like the Star was 2? And the News Choice? Oh, the chart where you had the Star, but then you had the what was the name of it? The online only.
Yes.
Well, where are they? Number 1, number 2, number 3?
That was on the other source. I think it's in the reference.
Because in the table, it didn't show up that way. Like the Star didn't have as much circulation as the Malaysian.
Yeah, because that info is from the Audit Bureau of Circulation. It's from another source.
Okay. I'm still confused with that a little bit, but anyway. You have a story coming up, so let's talk about that a little bit. Next week you are to hand in your first news story about the first 6 weeks of the class. We have gone over that a little bit already. At least in relation to the quiz that you took, we talked about the lead and what the lead should look like. Again, I encourage you to take a look at the sample A paper. I probably had that. Where did I put that? Sample. Okay, this is on our Moodle site. But again, we already talked about the lead and the complete lead and what they should look like. You notice here in the second paragraph, I talked about some other things. So the lead was about marketing and PR in the 21st century. But then in the second paragraph, I started kind of telling the reader, but there's some other things they talked about also. So speakers at the conference also explained how mobile technology is quickly providing broadband internet access to remote villages around the globe, which is having a major impact on PR marketing as well as world cultures. So I introduced some other ideas that were talked about. And then after that, it's not a total inverted pyramid. What you're really probably going to decide is the first thing as you look at your notes. And by the way, you should be taking notes in here, so you have some direct quotes. If you're not taking notes in class, you're making a mistake. Or taking them from you can take them from the video, but you should be getting some direct quotes. Probably what your first decision is, what will be my lead? What's the most interesting thing that we talked about? The most impactful or most interesting, something that it should catch your reader's attention. Be sure to remember that you're writing to somebody not in this class. You're not writing to me. You're writing to your friend that doesn't attend our class, or somebody like that. Somebody who does not know what we talked about. Somebody just showed me their paper and they had a bunch of bullet items, for example. If I were not in the class, there was not enough information in the bullet items for me to really understand all those bullet items. And so if you have bullet items, and you can, make sure you give enough information that is clear to the person not in class. For example, if you start trying to explain those 8 characteristics of the newspapers, it will be a little bit challenging to explain it in maybe one sentence, each bullet item one sentence, to explain what each of those characteristics means. But that's what you have to do. If you're going to bring it up, you have to explain them. You can't just list their names, because their names, as we've already talked about, don't always make sense to the average person. And so somebody not in this class, if you just list the names, that's not going to work. That doesn't tell us anything to the average person not here. So you have to tell enough that the person not here understands what those characteristics are. Now, I'm not saying you even should include that. You might totally ignore Poe. I don't care if you use Poe at all. You might find that your story is better by totally ignoring Poe and forgetting he exists because he's so complicated. And because of the very thing that I said the other day. So what? His book lacks some of the so what factor. He's analyzed all this stuff, but so what? Doesn't matter to the person who's not in this class. Can you make that interesting, the person not in this class? Now, you probably can get some things from Poe that are interesting, some of the stuff he talks about. But I'm not sure it's the characteristics. I'm not sure that's interesting to anybody outside this class, at least not in a comparative way. Now, you might be able to say, maybe compare newspapers to manuscripts and kind of explain what an advancement that was in the world of media, and use some of his discussion on how things have advanced because of the printing press and so forth, just more or less like was talked about today. So there is information from Poe that could be used, but I'm not sure it's the characteristics per se. It may spin off of the characteristics when you start talking about velocity and range and all that sort of stuff. There may be information in there that would be interesting to somebody, but I'm not sure that it comes from a list of those characteristics or even a discussion of all the characteristics, but just some discussion of some of the characteristics that are outstanding. What really happened when we went from speech to manuscript? What really happened, so what happened when we went from manuscript to the printing press? If you can discover the so what elements, then that's good to put in your story. But if the way he puts it with his scientific analysis is probably, first off, very hard to explain, and very hard to explain to somebody why it's important to them. Why is it important to your friend who does not in this class to understand this, or interesting to them? Why would it be? So in using Poe, you're going to have to use them, I'd say, very strategically. The other, with Lull, it's a little bit easier, but probably even then, even Lull, it's in looking at the so what of Lull, it really comes to today. Why is this important today? Now, for example, we're talking about newspapers. It may be important to understand that American newspapers have transitioned from yellow journalism, sensationalism, through an objective age where everybody tried to be fair, to this new interpretive era when the press has been somewhat politicized, and they're expressing, they're trying to come to conclusions as to whether Donald Trump is evil or good or whatever, for example, and they're taking a stance, and they're coming. Their beliefs are being reflected very strongly in their writing, their agenda setting, as I mentioned, as well as the way they source it. What they're always going after sources that are anti-Trump right now, and the way they express it. All those things, the agenda setting, the sourcing, and the expression is all biased right now. Now, maybe he is a crook. I'm not saying he's not, but is way past the objective era of journalism, way past that. And so we are, I would say, in the interpretive era. And that has pros and cons to that. So in that sense, you could go back and cover that history that we were talking about right now with newspapers, for example, and how that is relevant to us today. That it is changing today. You can talk about some of the stuff that has happened in traditional media that I talked about, particularly newspapers and their fate and whether they'll survive. The question I talked about today about investigative reporting. If the newspapers die, who's going to do the investigative reporting? Even if I think some of it's bad, at least it exists. I'm not looking forward to a day when the newspapers don't have enough money to do investigative reporting, because they're the ones in America who have done most of it. And a lot of it's very good. Even if I think some of it's biased, I don't like the idea of a world without investigative reporters. So I can complain about how they're doing it, but I don't want them to disappear because their work is important. Anyway, so as you, going back to the organization, you decide what am I going to emphasize, and then what I do when I have a complicated story, let's say I'm covering a city council meeting, as I mentioned to somebody, I was on the city council, and they'd give us an agenda typically of about 20 items we were going to talk about on city council. Most of those items are not interesting to our readers. So most of those 20 items were not even reported at all. They're just not interesting enough. And so you get it down to maybe considering the top 10, maybe half the items on the agenda. Do we cover, and even then you probably cut it down from there. Because there's even items 7, 8, and 9, in trying to squeeze too much into a story, it's not going to make it into the newspaper. And you know that it's going to get cut out. If you write it, it's going to get cut out anyway. There's just not enough room or interest in it, and the editors are going to show that. So you decide which is the most important one. You feature that in the lead. You may feature that plus maybe 2 other items in the second paragraph, and complete those 5 W's. So if you cover 7 items in this city council story, you may still only mention 3 of them in the complete lead, and still 4 of them are not yet mentioned. And then you start organizing, and probably where I say it's not quite inverted pyramid is because the most interesting thing from item 2 is probably more important than the least interesting thing from item 1. Well, you can't very well go totally, you can't make your story make sense and cover only the lead item or the one sentence from each item, and then go back and then another sentence about each item, and then another sentence about each item, that would make no sense. The reader couldn't follow that. And so the closest you can come to an inverted pyramid is I'll cover A first, and you'll cover all of A. You won't come back to it. You'll cover A and get it done, your subject A. Then you cover your subject B and your subject C, subject 3, D, whatever. And even then, you may not put them in absolute inverted pyramid order, because you may see, now, even though I say it's the fourth important, item D that I'm going to cover in my story ties easier to item A. So I'm going to go item A to item D, not because D is the second most important, but because it ties together easier. They're similar. So I can make that transition more smoothly by going to item D, even though it's not as important as item B or C. And then you go to B, and then you go to C. Some of your items, as you transition from one item to another, you may make a fairly, it may not be real smooth, but again, you're at a conference. At some conferences I've gone to, they've had well over 100 sessions. Well over 100 sessions. Now, we don't report on all the sessions. We as a reporter, I would go the ones that I thought were most interesting and maybe had the most relationship to my readers. So I would go to that conference and I would select which ones I was going to go to. In my case, I would also maybe get email addresses for the speakers so I could email them some questions afterwards. But, you don't need to do that, but that's what I would do. And then, again, just like the city council, just like this, I would start covering the most interesting and work my way down. And in some cases, the transition would be not all that smooth. It'd be another presenter at the conference noted that, and you almost start a new lead with that part of the story. We know from paragraph 2, if you've explained that this is a conference, then the reader knows it's a conference. And they know that there were lots of speakers. And so making a somewhat rough transition to a new speaker, to what a new speaker taught, isn't that awkward, because you've already alerted them that this was a conference. You might even estimate how many speakers there have been during the first 6 weeks. When you count Lul and you count Poe and you count as speakers and you count the video as a speaker and you count all the student presenters as speakers, you could estimate that at this conference there were, I'm guessing, at least 30 speakers. There were 30, the conference included some 30 speakers on a variety of subjects. Now, when you make a fairly rough transition from one speaker to another speaker, it's not that unexpected. It's not going to jar the reader that much, because you've already told them there's 30 speakers. And maybe 30 speakers who spoke on a range of subjects, such as you give them a couple of different topics they spoke about. So they're already expecting to be jarred to have a change from one speaker to another speaker, but because you set them up on paragraph 2. And so paragraph 2 becomes very important in getting their attention and getting them to understand how this story is going to roll out. And if they know that, again, that there were a lot of speakers there talking about a lot of different subjects, then your transition can be a little bit less smooth if, another speaker said that da-da-da, whatever. Okay? But that is the hardest part for you guys, I'm sure, is going to be making those transitions. So why I'm trying to explain some ideas on how to do it. It's one of the hardest things for a professional reporter to do. So while on the one hand, I'm with your lead, the way I'm teaching you how to do the lead, that should actually be the easiest part. How to do a speech interview lead. What they said, who said it. Just very easy. Everybody can use this lead, a speech interview lead, if they want to. And everybody can kind of copy the nature of these first 2 paragraphs. But then after that is when it actually gets more interesting, more complicated, because you guys haven't done a multi-topic story before, probably. But once you get into it, hopefully you'll figure it out. But it'll be challenging for you. I understand that. I'll also probably this week, I will be putting up a quiz in the next couple of days based on, it'll just be that 0-point quiz or 1/2 of 1% quiz as part of your participation grade. So if you don't do it, it's not that big a deal. But we've had some presentations where now we've had some additional questions. So like today's questions and the one from the last presentation will be in there. We skipped one of the early presentations because I didn't have the questions in hand, or I can't remember why exactly. I'll tell you which presentations will be included when I set up that quiz for you. But anyway, so you can expect to see that on Moodle sometime in the next couple of days also. Any other questions or problems? We're out of time and then some. So if not, work hard and hopefully, again, don't, I'll be a little bit gentler on my grading of this first story, but what I want to do is give you some good feedback on it and help you to become better writers. As I said, I want this class to be more practical than it's designed to be. And so one of the best things I can do for you is to have you do some writing and give you some feedback to help prepare you for news writing class or whatever else other classes that will come along. So I try to have some writing in all my classes to help do that because, like I say, one of the biggest complaints I have from the employers is that we haven't given our students enough practice. And so I try to give you practice in any class you take from me to help get you ready. Okay, thank you.